Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Keesa Schreane, and welcome to a special edition of Refinitiv Perspectives Live, where we'll be giving some data commentary around the unfolding of yesterday's opening debate between the two presidential candidates. It was considered a volatile debate. In terms of the issues, COVID-19, race, violence in America, climate change, and the economy were the featured subjects of the discussion. Joining us today to help us digest the data is Managing Director of the Americas at Refinitiv, Mike Dionne. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Keesa. Nice to be here.
So let's just start from the top. What have you seen in the way your customers have been following the data behind those themes that were discussed during the debate?
Yeah, so the way that we track this is around icon usage, and data from the US saw a peak around terms for COVID and diseases. Slightly behind that was a peak in usage for terms around US president. We saw a slow decline up to August, but now usage around these terms are beginning to climb, which shows that as November 3rd is around the corner, we can anticipate the same trend.
Now, let's look broadly over the media. Over the last few days, Mr. Trump's tax disclosures have been highlighted. During the debate, Trump was directly asked about this. Did his answer affect public opinion at all?
Yeah, a Reuters Ipsos poll from a few days ago showed that Biden leads Trump nationally. I think we all understand that national polls in some ways aren't as relevant as what we're seeing in some of the swing states. So the race is much tighter when we start looking at key states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. I think. So I think it's really keeping an eye on those tight races in the key swing states is central to this.
Okay, so let's take a look at the market specifically right now, Mike. What have we seen so far? We're just talking about everything being in the green territory as of a few minutes ago, earlier in the hour, then the S&P, Dow Jones, as well as the NASDAQ. But what can we expect moving forward? And for example, what is the data showing us about confidence in the Fed?
Yeah, so in terms of the Fed confidence, we've seen that confidence returning to the dollar with other major currencies easing. The euro, for instance, dipped from a 1-week high of down to 1.1727. Turning our attention to the COVID situation, I think it's safe to say the situation in the U.S. is tough. What data do we have on the current state? I think the answer there lies in the macro app that we've got in Icon that shows the amount of cases globally and on a country level. As you can see, the U.S. is quite ahead from a death toll perspective owing to the coronavirus pandemic.
Now, let's take a look at the economy. So Trump has said many times that his administration has built the greatest economy in history. What is the data saying?
Well, Keesa, it's interesting. With the largest decline in the unemployment rate during the Obama-Biden administration, Trump's continued progress on this from 2016 onward has now been wiped out by COVID. So Biden's statement about Trump being the first president in history to have the lowest jobs of any president in office isn't wrong, but clearly there are extenuating circumstances. The same can also be said about the GDP. A plus for the Trump administration is that average hourly earnings has spiked due to transfer payments and COVID relief. I think the final points I'll make there, clearly hourly earnings are in many respects what is impacting how people are feeling about their current situation. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays itself out in the polls.
Great. Thank you so much for that feedback, Mike. Specifically, the hourly earnings, there's a huge piece of that. Thank you for that insight. We appreciate you. Joining us now is Jim Mitchell, who is head of America's Oil Analysis at Refinitiv. Jim, thank you for your time.
It was a pleasure to be here.
So what shifts have you seen in your analysis in the last 24 hours since the debate? So we're looking at immediately before the debate and then afterwards. What shifts and changes have you seen?
Well, it's a little bit embarrassing that the world gets to see the fist fight that is happening in U.S. politics right now, and no more clear place is that happening than in the energy business. especially as it relates around oil production, refining, and power generation. In the last 24 hours or 24 hours prior to the election, we saw a pretty healthy dip, about a 3%, a little more dip in crude futures. And then today we're up a little bit. I think the dip yesterday probably had more to do with a technical factor in the market than it did leading up to the election. And I think today is a more reflective of what the industry thinks. Basically, we're stuck for the next 34 days between this range of about $36 to the bottom side and about $42 to the upside in WTI.
Okay, so let's talk about the green economy. We heard about that last night, especially from Mr. Biden. What is the data saying about a possible shift away from oil in the short term as well as the longer term?
Right. So I was actually hoping to hear more, as I would imagine that many of the listeners were. The two candidates have been very clear on what their stance is. President Trump's America First energy policy that he put into effect shortly after he became president in 2016 is still mostly intact, minus a piece of coal. The coal piece, I think, has been kind of pushed aside because he figured out he's not going to win that. Also, there is no mention in either one about the nuclear aspect, mostly because both sides agree that they want to increase funding for nuclear energy. Now, on Vice President Biden's side, if anybody is interested, they can go to joebiden.com and look at the 9 key elements that he talks about. Vice President Biden was correct in that it's not the Green Deal. It's not the new Green Deal that he's talking about. Obviously, that is a backdrop for what he's talking about, but there's some elements in the new Green Deal that a politician is really not going to support.
Right. And also, Jim, do you feel that the oil markets will react one way versus the other as you talk about the green economy versus moving forward with what already exists? What are your thoughts about the reactions for one scenario versus the other scenario?
Well, I suspect that there will be a initial knee-jerk reaction, regardless of which candidate wins. If President Trump wins, it'll be positive for the oil industry, the pipeline industry, and the refining industry. If Vice President Biden wins, I think it'll be a little less positive for that group and more positive for the renewables. But it's one thing to note that what Vice President Biden is talking about, it can't be flipped on like a switch. There are billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure that need to be built to get to where he's talking about. And certainly he knows that. So after the knee-jerk reaction, as Mike mentioned on November 4th, hopefully we find out what the answer is, hopefully. I suspect there will be a knee-jerk reaction. It's going to be the months after that when the market starts to figure out, regardless of who's president, people still need electricity. The people in New York and Minnesota and Chicago are still going to need natural gas for heat.
Sure. And hopefully we'll do some data analysis into whether or not we'll find that out on November 4th or afterwards, and just what the history has been there. That's a great point, Jim. I want to shift a bit and talk about, to you, Mike, about what your customers are seeing as important for Q1, specifically as it relates to the pandemic. I know there's still a lot of information that is yet to come to us. So what are they saying about the pandemic, their thoughts about the market, regardless of who wins?
Well, they're looking at it through a number of different lenses. I think first and foremost, much like we are here at Refinitiv, they're looking at it through the lens of their employees. And many of them, like us, scrambled to a virtual environment when in early March, by and large, this is when it hit. So I think first and foremost, they're looking to make sure that their employees are safe. And that is in light of considerations as to when they come back into their offices. So, I think you're starting to see amongst many of our customers a slow trickle back into their offices, but in very small ways relative to where they were prior to the pandemic. So that would be first. I think in terms of how they are reacting and looking to maintain a semblance of business as normal, I would say that in many respects they're turning to data for exploration to explain what's going on and what the future may hold. So that trend has certainly continued and grown. I think the final point I'll make there is our customers, when they've got major projects, I think this is a microcosm for the broader economy. A lot of little things are getting done, but big projects seem to be put on hold. So I think three different ways that they're viewing it. In terms of the market, I think Jim alluded to this a bit. I think we're going to see a lot of ups and downs until we see resolution on this election, where ultimately it lands. I don't think any of them are signaling that if it goes Democrat, we'll see this in the market. If it goes Republican, we'll see that in the market. I think we'll see volatility, and maybe some of that volatility will continue until we have resolution on this election.
Okay, great. At this point, we'd love to open it up to questions from our fantastic audience. So please send those questions through. Just to continue, in terms of the issues that your customers and the marketplace in general might like to see covered during these debates that maybe aren't mentioned, do either of you have thoughts on what you're hearing from your customers, what you're hearing from the marketplace on some key themes that would be great to include in some of those questions during the debates that aren't already being covered?
Jim, I'll defer to you first if you want to take that.
Yeah, sure. So being in Houston, Texas, much of my surrounding is energy-based. Obviously a big oil base, but there's also a very substantial renewable energy base and electricity traders, natural gas traders. Houston's a hub for that. One of the interesting things that I'm hearing about that I didn't anticipate is the bond market. As a former oil trader, I'm vaguely familiar with the bond market, not brave enough to jump into it, but vaguely familiar with it. And the bond market for U.S. energy infrastructure on one side or another, I think that is going to be key and probably one of the things that moves the most or depending upon who is elected president.
And Jim, just in keeping with that theme, I'm just wondering, as it relates to the area of risk, do you foresee any huge changes in the regulatory environment as it relates to the energy industry, depending on the direction that we move in?
Yeah. So what we've been experiencing in the last almost 4 years now, and then the prior 8 have been very different to what we've seen before in terms of permitting. This aspect of the market that people really don't pay attention to because it's highly detailed, very legalistic, but it affects a lot of money and it affects a lot of projects. And we're seeing that, and I won't get into the details, but there's some energy projects that are being held up by judges where it appears that it's political based. It's hard to say, but it certainly appears that way. Okay,
great. So on your side, Mike, a little different marketplace there, but do you see any potential regulatory concerns coming up or any risks depending on the direction that we move in?
Yeah, I think in broad brushes, people would anticipate a little bit more regulation than we've seen with this administration if there were to be a change. I don't know yet that that's manifested itself in any, data or sentiment in terms of where the market's headed. But I think it is fair to say that in a Democratic administration, we probably are more inclined to see more regulation. It came up in the debate yesterday to some extent, some of the initiatives that the Democratic candidate is putting forward, suggest that there will be some regulation, especially as it pertains to things that may impact climate change. But, again, what I would have liked to have seen is an opportunity for both candidates to have, more time to talk about what they would specifically be doing and, so that we in turn as voters can make some decisions based on policies as opposed to what I think we got last night. But Anyway, that's probably a topic for another day that we consume an entire 20 minutes on.
Great. And speaking of a topic for another day, we will be back. So I'm looking forward to discussing the upcoming debates with you. Thank you so much, Mike, Dionne, and Jim Mitchell. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
And to all of our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Follow our coverage of the U.S. elections on Refinitiv.com by using the link or scanning the QR code on the screen now. Thank you so much for joining us today, and be well.